I'm going to show you now how to finish. A general rule in terms of finishing is if you keep putting paint on and it's actually not improving it, it's time to put the brushes down and you're done. I do have a few more highlights and a few more details I want to add, and I also want to show you two techniques that may enrich the surfaces and give you a little bit more form. So first of all, I'll start with the glazing techniques. Now glazing essentially means very thin paint, and there's two ways you can do that. There's one called a dry glaze, and I'll show you exactly what that actually means. So I've got some paint here on my palette, not an awful lot, and I'm going to wipe all of the excess off. You can see here there's hardly any paint on my brush. Wiping all of the excess off my brush. I don't want too much paint on it. What I'm going to do is essentially scumble over the surface. So you can see here I've started to layer up some dark shadows so that Shelley sits within the space, but some of those need to be deeper. So I'm going to continue to layer that up really softly. And you see it has a very soft edge. You don't see any of the marks, but it is just deepening all of those shadows. And I'll continue working to really get it to sit comfortably. Within that space. Now you can do that for shadows, but you can also do that for lights. So the same technique applies. A very clean, dry brush. I'm going to grab some white for the highlights. A bit harder to see because I'm on a white palette. I'm taking all of the excess off my paintbrush with a cloth, and I'm going to go back in some of these softer areas here and just add some of those highlights in. Again, I don't want to see a brush mark. I want it to blend into what's already there. But it is just really lifting all of those highlights. I can see everything that's underneath the paint. All the layers in there, but it does all of a sudden those highlights are a little bit starker. That's called dry glazing. The other technique that I want to show you is called wet glazing, and the technique is exactly the same. Essentially, you're using very, very thin paint to build up a surface, but this time, when using more than paint, I've got some medium on my palette. It's quite thin. I'm going to take my very dark paint. I'm using very, very thin paint this time. I'm going to come back into some of these other areas, the depth in the nose. And add the detail with that very, very thin layer of paint. You can see I've started to add a little bit of the whisker marks. So all of those final details and deepening some of those areas as well. And I'll keep going in some of those areas just to kind of give it a little bit more depth in the eyes, using that glazing technique. Now, you can use glazing to put in final details, but I can also really bring out some of the richer colours within the coat as well. So essentially, it's the same technique. I'm using the original colours. So I've got this nice ochre yellow. that I've added to my palette. So I've got my yellow ochre colour. I've mixed up a very, very thin layer of paint, and I'm just going back over the top of some of those more yellow areas, and it's going to give it a richness of colour. The trick with the glaze is that you build it up, so multiple very, very thin layers. I'll wait for that to dry and I'll apply some of that colour. You should never see a glaze. You shouldn't see it sitting on the surface. It should blend seamlessly into what's already underneath. It can give much more form, so it can help you model your forms. So whether that's, Shelley here, the front of her leg, or it can make the colours incredibly rich and give them a great depth. And you can see it's bringing out just a little bit more richness in some of those areas in the coat. I'll wait for that to dry and I can keep layering those things back on as well. It's not changing anything underneath, but it does give the surface and the coat a real richness and depth of colour. And finally, we have the final details. Now you'll see that I've left this to the very, very last part of the image. I'm putting in the final details, the highlight in the eye. You see how already that just makes the whole face pop, gives it far more focus. I'm also going to just add some of those highlights on the nose, just ever so slightly. Just the smallest amount of highlight there after I've darkened the tips of the nose and the highlights on has really drawn that snout out and, allowed it to kind of, have much more sense of volume. Very, very small highlights just in the eyes and the nose can actually go a very, very long way. I am also just going to pull this paw out a little bit more, just so that it sits in the front. I am just going to sharpen up some of those edges. And that's going to pull that paw forward. Things in high contrast come forward. And so I'm just going to make sure that that's in very high contrast in the front there, pulling that paw a little bit more forward. Very, very subtle highlights, but they can actually do quite a bit. And that's how we finish